Hello everyone, my name is Joshua Bellamy.
I'm Sam Kilpatrick.
We own and operate Boulted Bread in Raleigh, North Carolina. Today we're going to be making some no-knead sourdough in our field company Dutch oven.
Let's get started.
So first things first, we are going to refresh our sourdough starter. Now depending on your timeline, about 8 hours before you're planning on mixing your dough, I will pull this out of the fridge or pull it out down from the counter and go ahead and refresh it. So I'm gonna go ahead and take it and dump most of it in the trash and keep about a tablespoon's worth in the container, maybe about 2 tablespoons worth. You don't have to get super exact with it. Then I'm going to refresh it with equal parts water and whole grain flour. You can use rye flour, wheat flour. You can also use white flour, and I'm gonna go ahead and stir it up. I'm gonna keep this in a pretty temperate climate in my kitchen, so find a spot that's around 70 to 75 degrees. Usually on top of the refrigerator works well for that. But if you wanted to speed things up, you could find a warmer environment. All right, so with a no-knead recipe, it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward, and really you're allowing time to do most of the work for you. Instead of folding and kneading, time is just sort of gonna naturally organize the gluten strands, develop the gluten strands, and give you a really nice dough and a really nice loaf of bread without too much work on your end. Here I have all of our flour and all of our salt already scaled out. I'm gonna plop in about 50 grams of my starter. The other nice thing about the no-knead recipe is that you don't need a ton of starter. You don't need to really worry about using super ripe starter. It can be a little old, it can be a little young. Either way it'll work. And once we add the starter, we're gonna add our water as well. All right, so once the water's added, we're just bring this all together, sort of evenly distribute this salt, and then start massaging together all the ingredients. And once again, I'm trying to early on really focus on hydrating as much of the flour as I possibly can.
How do you know when to stop?
Well, so if you take a look at it, Sam, there's there's some dry spots still down there, and it's still a little stringy. So I'm really just gonna keep going until all those dry spots are gone, until I can't feel any big chunks of flour in the dough. It's gotten pretty close now, pretty close to where I want it. It's still a pretty shaggy mess. I like to just sort of pay attention to how it looks throughout the entire fermentation. It really starts to mellow out and get super silky as time goes on. It's a really fun transformation to watch. I'm gonna cover it and leave it for 15 minutes and then come back and we'll give it a fold. We have our dough here. It's been about 15 minutes since we mixed all the ingredients together. I'm just gonna give it a fold. My hand is damp. I'm gonna pull up the side, pull it into the center. I'm gonna repeat that all around the outside of the loaf. For the no-knead, it's nice to get those folds in early. That sort of develops a little bit of the gluten early on. We'll come back and visit this again in about 15 minutes. Good night. We gave our dough 4 folds, one at every 15 minutes for the first hour. It's been about 10 hours since then. So slowly but steadily, our dough has fermented, it's grown, it's transformed. It's grown a lot. You can see it's probably doubled in size roughly. The consistency is way less shaggy than it was when we started mixing it. And that it's all time. Time did all that stuff for us. It organized the gluten. It allowed the sourdough starter that we put in to completely ferment. So now let's dump it out on the table. So I'm grabbing some flour and just sort of giving it a nice even toss, Frisbee toss onto the table. And I'm gonna do the same for the top of the dough. Take my scraper, sort of pry out the edges of the dough, pop it out onto the table just like that. Oh, this dough's great. So it's super active. You can see the bubbles of fermentation in there. It's nice and stringy where it should be. We want to sort of bring it all in and to make it a little bit of a uniform shape and let it rest here for a little while before we give it its final shape. So I'm gonna take the sides and fold them in and then rotate it 90 degrees and do the same with these sides. And we're gonna let it rest just like that with a towel on top of it for about 15 minutes. Today I'm gonna use a proofing basket. This is one that we use at Boulted Bread, but yesterday at home I baked a loaf of bread using just a metal pot as a proofing basket. So you don't need to get super fancy in it. Most people have a pot at their house. You can use that. The important part is that you wanna use some sort of cloth to line your basket and coat it pretty heavily. So I'm gonna use my scraper and sort of gently lift my dough off the counter, turn it over, and I'm gonna fold the outsides in. So folding the top about 2/3 of the way down, folding the bottom about 2/3 of the way up, folding the left about 2/3 of the way over to the right, and folding the right about 2/3 of the way over to the left. Now I have this like nice square lump of dough. It's nice and evenly shaped. And I'm gonna plop it right here into my proofing basket. Our bread is proofed. We have our dusted parchment here. So I'm gonna gently, using my hands, dump the dough out onto the parchment. Sort of even it out a little bit on the parchment. And for scoring it, I'm gonna use a lame. You could also use a bread knife, works just as well. And I'm not really worried too much about making it beautiful. I just want it to open up nicely in the oven. So once it's scored, I'll take my scissors and cut some of this excess parchment off. So I have my hot Dutch oven here, protecting my hands, take the lid off, picking the dough up from the parchment, just gently lower it into the Dutch oven. Watch on your hands as you do it. I'll pop the lid on and bake it. All right, so we have our loaf of no-knead out of the oven. It's cooled off, and it's a really beautiful loaf of bread. So when I'm sort of judging a loaf of bread, I look for a color gradient on the bake, so some darker spots, some medium spots, and some lighter spots of brown. I like to give it a good thump so you get some good sound on the bottom. It should sound like nice and hollow. And really, like, it's all a tactile thing too. Like, I'll just hold it and sort of give it a squeeze, and you can hear it crunching a little bit, and it just sort of feels done. I know that's sort of ambiguous to say, but it feels done. It feels like the appropriate volume for how heavy it is. So it's a really nice loaf of bread.
I can't wait to see it. Let's cut into it.
So now we're gonna cut into our loaf of bread. Serrated knife. Cool. So we got pretty nice crumb here. Like, all the cells are nice and open. Smells really good. Not too sour, which is always a plus. And yeah, this is a nice loaf of bread. And it wasn't much work.